Welcome to Sweet Talk. This broadcast is brought to you by the Continuing Education Workforce Training Division of Idaho State University's College of Technology. This podcast is part of our continuing outreach efforts, and the format is conversational. We will be having conversations with businesses, professionals, entrepreneurs, community agencies, and, in all cases, difference makers. Now, let's get started with Sweet Talk. Hey, hello, everyone. Hello, welcome. This is Jason Batalden. Welcome to our Sweet podcast this wonderful morning. Today is our Halloween special. Right?
Yay!
It's kind of amazing we can actually have a Halloween special. So we're hoping for kind of epic Halloween special, so no pressure on our guest today. Our guest, I'm going to let her introduce herself, but our guest is Brenda Pace, and she is an Idaho master naturalist, which, just from our audience, please do not Google that term. So you might get in trouble. We learned the hard way.
Oh, dear.
Yeah. Naturalist has many meanings. You can apply naturalist to a lot of different things. So anyway.
Oh, that's funny.
Anyway, so Brenda, please, before I get myself in trouble, tell us about yourself just a little bit.
Okay. So I'm Brenda Pace. I am actually a retired archaeologist.
Oh, wow.
I earned both bachelor's and master's degrees here in these very hallowed halls.
Oh, wow. Nice.
back in the 1980s, yep. And then I went on to have a career as a professional archaeologist for 3 decades at the Idaho National Lab. And I retired, though. I was lucky and able to retire early. And so now that I get to choose what I do every day, I've found a lot of satisfaction in volunteering my time with groups like the Idaho Fish and Game and other federal agencies, mostly related to wildlife. And I've found that one of my favorite topics and areas to dedicate my time now is to bats and their conservation and research on them.
Which brings us to why this is our Halloween special.
Bats.
So, well, I warned you before we started this. I said that my wife is sort of fascinated with bats. Yeah. And so she has a whole list of questions I'm supposed to ask today on this. I am not very familiar, with bats. I know we have them.
Yes.
And I know that they're a lot smaller, a bat is, than I ever had pictured. So this kind of goes into those myths. But before we go any farther, why do you like bats? What was it that
as an archaeologist, I spent a lot of time with bats because I got to do a lot of research in lava tube caves and spent time there. So I hung out with bats for many years and just got curious about them. And I was really, really lucky because there are some fantastic folks that live here in Eastern Idaho, wildlife biologists by training and education, who were willing to mentor me and help me learn about bats and find really nice opportunities to sort of give back to them because they're kind of vulnerable right now in our modern world. Yeah. So
they're very sensitive to
climate change, habitat. There's diseases that are threatening their very existence. And green energy is also a threat to them in the form of wind towers that have been erected along their migratory corridors. Bats echolocate. They're fantastic at echolocation. That's how they move through their world. They send out sound, and that bounces back to their ears and nose structures. And so that's how they operate in their world. But wind towers are a problem because they move so quickly. They look like gentle giants, but they're really going 300 miles an hour. And bat echolocation just doesn't have that in its history, and so they're harmed by wind towers pretty significantly. So bats are vulnerable, and it feels really good to be able to devote some of my time to helping to understand their basic ecology and helping the biologists to know how to maybe mitigate some of those losses that we're seeing from wind towers and disease.
So you had mentioned earlier that bats, you got to know them because of caves.
Right, yes.
so dumb question of the day. They live where? I mean, where do bats live?
That's a great
in caves
question.
Only? I mean,
no. So there are 14 species of bats that patrol the night skies in the summertime here in Idaho. Some of them are migratory, and some of them stay here for the winter. You can't spend a winter in Idaho outdoors. No. So they hibernate, just like grizzly bears.
No kidding.
Yes. So the species that stay in Idaho hibernate.
So hold on just a minute.
Yeah.
You know, this week is we have Fat Bear Week.
Oh.
National Park, they do Fat Bear Week.
Because they get really fat.
Yeah.
Maybe we should do a Fat Bat Week.
You know,
because I'm assuming they got to get fat before they go hibernate.
They do. And their studies show that the ones that get really fat, the fat bats survive the winter better and they fight off disease better.
See, that's the same thing I tell my wife when she tells me.
Yep. That's right.
I fight off disease.
We're good mammals, right?
I don't move real fast. You know, you put me, I stay there, I don't move.
Yes.
I'd make a good bat.
Yeah. So I've been fortunate in my career to be able to spend a lot of time in lava tube caves. And because there are sensitive archaeological materials in caves and sensitive biological, including bats, I was able to kind of work with those biologists out at the Idaho National Lab. And they helped me to understand the needs of bats and how sensitive they are in the wintertime because they go deep into torpor. They reduce their heart rates down to 10 beats per minute. When they're foraging actively for insects, they're beating like 1,000 beats per minute. So they shut down. Their temperature goes to ambient, which is from 28 to 40 degrees. So they do that all winter long, but to do that, they have to be fat. They got to go into hibernation fat. And if they're awakened frequently, they'll burn all their fat reserves and can starve to death in the wintertime. So they need a nice, quiet lava tube or old mine shaft or abandoned buildings. Yeah.
So I was going
to survive.
I was bringing that Redfish Lake.
Yeah.
The lodge at Redfish. I don't know, it's been a few years since we've been up there, but we camped up there one year and we'd come down to where the lodge is right there on the lake. And if you came down in the early evening, you could see all the bats come out.
Oh, that's a fun thing to do.
The walls.
Yes.
So I don't know. I mean, I'm sure if you're a homeowner, you're like, bats. But it was pretty. Yeah. First of all, the whole. I know. Let's start with this is fascinating to me, but bats are not very big.
They're not.
We're talking about myths, right? We talked earlier about myths of bats.
Yeah.
The giant vampire bats and the bats that we're all scared of.
Yeah.
Those are not the bats we're talking about.
No, especially not here in Idaho. Right. All the bats that live in Idaho are relatively small. Their wingspans will range from 5 to 7 inches out to about 9 to 10 inches. There's 14 different species. They're small mammals. And one of the myths I like to address is that bats are like flying mice. A lot of people think that bats, they kind of look like mice. They're small and brown and furry. They are small mammals, but they're they're not even remotely related to mice. They're not remotely related to rodents. They're long-lived. Did you know that bats can live to be sometimes 40 years old in the wild?
No, I did not.
Do mice live that long?
No,
they don't. They're very short-lived. And the other thing that's different between mice and bats is that bats have one baby or pup per year. That's what they call it. Yep, they call bat babies pups. So they only have one per year, sometimes twins. So they're very long-lived, and they reproduce very, very slowly. So they're very, very different from mice. So that's one of the myths I like to address.
Sammy.
I know that a lot of people think that bats are blind. Are bats blind?
No, bats aren't blind either. They see about as well as we do, actually, just generally, and they see quite well at night.
I'm kind of blind.
The way I am too, obviously.
Right.
But the way that they see their world is through echolocation. So they have specialized vocal cords and specialized receivers in their ears and their membranes around their faces. So they bounce sound off of objects in their environment to know where they're at. That's how they see. They see so well through echolocation. They can see things as fine as a human hair. They can't see color. That's about the only thing they can't see when they're echolocating. The other cool thing about echolocation is each species has a slightly different frequency and shape to their echolocation calls. So you can record bats with a bat detector and then actually download that data and see what different species you have around you. Yeah, it's really, this echolocation is an amazingly sophisticated way to get around the world. And so bats aren't blind and they're not dumb. They're not going to get caught in your hair or try to bite you on the neck. What they want to do is eat the insects, eat the mosquitoes that are flying around your head, or the moths that are terrorizing your tomato plants.
Right. Well, I think where I've encountered bats, not that I'm not I don't go out looking for bats. I kind of want to now, but
yeah, it's fun to do.
Like around like lights at dark night, if or something you can see them, or if you're sitting at that outside in that right dusk hour, you see these little things fly back and forth. And those are kind of cool. So
it's fun to go out and look at bats
they're
that way.
They're quiet and they're silent flyers.
They are,
They're just
sometimes
creatures.
they make a little bit of chatter. Those echolocation pulses are way high, very high frequencies. So we can't hear them with our ears. But sometimes they'll chatter at each other and squeak a little bit. So you can kind of hear some of those calls, but those echolocation calls are very, very high frequency.
Bats are not loners either, are mostly?
Mostly not.
They're colonies.
Actually, they roost in colonies.
Okay.
They roost in bat boxes or in old cabins or houses. Some species are more solitary than others. Okay. So there are some of the migratory tree bats kind of hang out by themselves, except during certain times of the year when they need to get together to procreate.
Oh yeah, everybody's got to do that.
That's right. That's right.
Right.
That's right. But yeah, they tend to roost in groups, and certainly bats are very doting mothers. So they'll become pregnant and be pregnant over their winter hibernation and give birth in the spring, usually to one pup or sometimes twins. And that little pup will stay with that mother bat for a full year. So those that migrate teach their pups where to go on their migration. Those that hibernate teach their pups where the wintertime place is and how to get there. So for the first couple of months when they learn to fly, usually July, August timeframe, there are tons of young bats all over eastern Idaho on training wheels, if you will. And their moms are watching closely, but those are times when they're giving birth and training those young pups that they congregate together in fairly sizable maternity colonies.
They get together for a school.
They do, like bat
pups
school.
To kindergarten, and they learn how to do all the things.
That's right. And in the wintertime, they also congregate into groups for their hibernation.
And that would help too, I suppose, with any heat. Well, I guess just being together.
Yeah.
So, all right, I'm going to ask Brenda.
What is your favorite species of bat in Idaho and why?
Oh gosh, I'm real partial to one that's called a western small-footed myotis. It's a small brown bat. He kind of this size, just real small. I'm partial to them because I've counted them on hibernation counts. So in the wintertime, we go in and count bats. One way to determine how well they're doing is to go count them while they're hibernating. We go in and out really fast because we don't want to wake them up, because it's hard for them. They'll burn too much fat stores if they wake up. So we're in and out quickly, but we count them. And the little western small-footed myotis back themselves into these cracks in these caves. And so all you can see is their tiny little face, which is about as big as your thumbnail. And they look like little bandits. They kind of have black masks. They're adorable. They're just really cute. And they love mosquitoes and other flying insects, which also love me. So I love it that these bats will eat insects.
That's a good point. So but going back to just kind of that mist thing a little bit real quick, bats are nocturnal.
Yes, they are nocturnal for sure.
I mean, because that's when the insects come out. There you go. I need to
that's
ask.
why.
Think before you ask a question, right?
Everything, really. Bats are like nature's bug zappers. Seriously, they are incredibly voracious predators of insects, of nocturnal insects. Yes.
So, how many insects can a bat typically consume?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked that because they eat like up to a third of their body weight in insects every night. If you equate that to us, do you like Big Macs?
Yeah.
You'd have to eat like 65 Big Macs to equal that terms in that rate of
mosquitoes
consumption.
aren't very big.
No,
They're not.
So they're consuming a lot.
Lots of insects. And pregnant or lactating females, so the doting moms, they'll eat the equivalent of their body weight in insects every night.
Wow.
It's amazing. They've done studies on agricultural fields, mostly in the Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
But they say there's a great scientific publication out there that shows that bats contribute around hundreds of millions of dollars to the agricultural industry here in Idaho alone. And nationwide, that goes up into the hundreds of billions of dollars.
By insect control.
By insect control. It's non-toxic, free pest control.
Okay. So is there an agricultural program to
preserve bats.
preserve bats, or to breed bats, or to
We may see that in the future because bats are being hit very, very hard by a disease called white nose syndrome, especially in the east. It's been moving west, but it has hit the east extremely hard. And one species of bat, the little brown bat, it's potentially going to have to be listed as an endangered species because of the huge losses. And the farmers back east have been noticing how much more they're having to invest in use of pesticides and different insect control things because of the loss of those little brown bats. So we may see some programs in the future to help bats. White nose is terrible. It's a hard disease for bats to fight.
Is white nose here?
It's not here in Idaho yet. It's slowly marching west. It's been found in California, the Dakotas, Wyoming. It's all around us.
Also, a few years ago, hiking at Craters of the Moon.
Oh, yes.
They basically, if you had hiked in another cave in another national park,
Yep.
they said you cannot hike our caves because of a spread of rabies currently.
It's white nose. It's because of this.
White nose.
It is the white nose disease that they're very, very concerned about. Because what white nose is an exotic fungus. It comes from Europe. It hit in 2006. It hit New York. And it began to wipe out bats. Millions of bats have died from white nose disease. And the disease is caused by this fungus. What happens is it hits bats when they're hibernating.
Oh.
It's a little bit like athlete's foot. It makes them itch. It attacks their wing membranes. And what happens if you wake a bat up a lot during the winter? It'll starve to death. And so they don't really die from the fungus. You don't die from athlete's foot, right? But they die because they're awakened too much during their torpor, and they eventually starve to death. So it's a hard, hard disease to fight. The other thing it does is when it hits a population of hibernating bats, it wipes out up to 95% of that colony. Now, for a species that reproduces so slowly, one baby per year, and lives to be 40 years old, it's very, very difficult to overcome those kinds of losses. And so that's why little brown bats are in trouble. So maybe we'll see some programs in the future that sponsor and help bats out.
So kind of along that line, and where, I'll ask, where do you go find bats? And should we go find bats?
Sure.
I mean, that kind of goes back to Paul's question. I mean, where do we go find bats in Southeast Idaho?
Yeah.
And if we do, what things should we keep in mind?
Yeah.
I mean, we don't want to be disturbing them, but we want to.
It's fun.
They're fun.
It's fun to see them. It really is. I've been surprised by the growth of programs at local zoos. So the zoo in Idaho Falls has a bat night, has 3 or 4 bat nights throughout the summer. I think the zoo here in Pocatello has a similar kind of program where you can actually go and meet with wildlife biologists who study bats, and they'll have bat detectors, and you'll get because parks where zoos tend to be located are great places for bats because there are so many insects there.
Oh, yeah.
So even in the absence of a bat walk or a bat program formally, you can go to a park at dusk, that golden hour just between dusk and a half hour after, when you can still see the sky and you can see bats flying around and foraging for insects around you. I'd encourage everybody to do that. Another thing you can do is go to, like, one of my favorite places is the dock on the Buffalo River up in Island Park.
Yeah, okay.
You can sit there at sunset and just sit there and, with your favorite adult beverage and watch thousands of bats just flying and catching all the mosquitoes. So they're not going to bite you. The bats are taking care of that for you. So any place where there's quiet water or
Sure.
large trees
Sure.
and that golden hour between sunset and a half an hour after, you'll see bats.
Very good.
Yeah.
Now, do they, how far, like from where they roost to their, I'm assuming they don't have to travel very far to find insects from where they hang. I mean, they probably know what neighborhood to set up a house in.
Yeah,
right?
they do. They generally do. And they always need to have water too. So they'll pick those places that have a little bit of water and a lot of insects, and they're happy.
All right. So that, Brenda, doggone it. I am.
That's
I'm
okay.
going to stop this. So that's the end of our 20-minute timer up. But
So fast.
real quick, before we sign off, you have some information that you want to share.
Sure.
And if you're interested in learning more about bats, Bat Conservation International, and their website is batcon.org. And not to be confused with, Sammy, a Batman convention, right? This is not a Comic-Con site.
But it's
for
a good way-
Batman.
A
Okay.
bad convention would be really cool.
Yeah, it would. It would.
But
It's a good way to remember it.
It is, right? So BATCON, batcon.org
Yeah.
to get more information on bats.
They have
and
great
we can get
information.
information about Idaho bats too there, right?
Bats in general on
Okay.
at BatCon International. And I would say if you want to know about bats locally, go to the zoo. Talk to the folks at the zoo or at Idaho Fish and Game.
Idaho
There's
Fish
some
and Game.
really great people at Fish and Game that can help you understand bats. And if you have trouble with bats or you're afraid of bats, you find one on the ground that you're not sure of, Idaho Fish and Game is definitely the people that you should talk to for those situations.
Very good. That's important. Look, this was a fantastic conversation.
Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. So,
Thank you.
Brenda, I am so glad you came all the way down from Idaho Falls to talk to us today. And we learned a lot. And again, I think we ran into that 20-minute time thing that's no fun.
So
but
fast.
Thank you for coming.
Yes.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
And always, if you need to get a hold of us, we're at Continuing Education Workforce Training here at ISU. That is, look us up online at ctrain.isu.edu. That is cetrain.isu.edu. And our phone number, 208-282.
3372.
Exactly what he said. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Happy Halloween.
Yes, happy Halloween, everybody. Yes, thank you.
Easter egg question? Can I do an Easter egg question for the end?
No, I
An
don't want.
Easter egg question.
So my wife says, Jason, would you please ask her about bats?
Oh, I was going to ask about bat boxes.
Well, bat boxes, but the
Yeah.
bat sex question.
Yeah.
So
Go for
bats, I understand, in colony, they actually, when their colony gets too big, they can actually, what's the term, become sterile or limit the ability to get pregnant?
Yeah.
So
So when they have sex in the summertime,
Mm-hmm.
right, when times are good and everything, or in the fall, just before their migration or their hibernation. So the females go into hibernation probably pregnant, and they can choose. The females can choose internally somehow whether or not that fetus will develop into a pup.
Oh, they can.
They can. Yep. And I would imagine it has to do with, if they're
Environmental
starving, if they're starving, the changes that are happening habitat-wise and climate-wise and everything may be happening too fast for them to actually sense that, oh, it's going to be bad here next year. I probably shouldn't have a baby,
Wow. Yeah,
But
it's
but
still a mystery, but they have.
it
that
is.
ability.
There's a lot of stuff about bats that's still a mystery because they're
And-
so hard to study. They really are difficult to study.
Well, if they hide in crevices and they're the
Right.
size of your thumbnail,
Right,
how do you
right,
ever find them?
right.
And so that brings up the other question:
The
bat
bat
boxes. Do they
boxes.
work? Is
They
it worth
do.
it? So you do want to put bat? I want to
would.
put bat boxes in my house. I hate
Yeah.
mosquitoes.
I've got one up. It hasn't been used yet, so I'm going to move it. Right.
Oh, okay, so,
So
you do.
don't get set on a place. Well, let me back up for just 1 second. if you have bats in your garage or in your shed or somewhere you don't want them, definitely put a bat box up near that location.
Right.
Because you can then exclude them. You got to do it at the right time of year because you don't want to seal them in.
Right.
And you also don't really want to mess with them if it's a maternity colony, because then the moms can get separated from the big pups, and that is just cruel and unusual. Yeah. So, right this time of year is actually a good time to exclude them because